So I would like to thank all the members of IIHS for the wonderful time preparing the whole festival. It was always a pleasure and it was always very professional. Thank you very much for that. And in the coming 3 days, the festival still is on, and then it is at the IIHS Central Campus, not here. And they will be showing something like 35 films in the next 3 days. And in case you miss one of those films, you can go to Delhi, starting from the 6th of October, to see it again, or the one that you didn't see, to see it then. So thank you very much for coming, everybody. And I hand it over to, I'm very sorry, I have to look at it, Subhashri from IIHS.
Thank you all for coming here this evening. It's really lovely to see so many familiar faces, colleagues, filmmakers, collaborators, friends, and that too on a Thursday evening in Bangalore traffic. So it really gladdens my heart. I'd really like to thank the Goethe Institute, Maxwell Bhavan, Bangalore, for collaborating with us this year in Delhi and in Bangalore. And in particular, I'd like to thank Dr. Klaus Heimes, Maureen Gonzalez, and Anna Hoffer. Thank you for all your support and help. And as Dr. Klaus Heimes said, there are 3 more days of the festival for the next 3 days at the Bangalore City campus, so please do come. I don't mean to take too much of your time. You didn't come to hear me, but to watch the film. But just to give you a brief history about how we got here. This is the 4th edition of the festival, and it's run by the Media Lab of the Indian Institute for Human Settlements. For those of you who don't know, IIHS is an interdisciplinary institution that works around urban practices. And it is with keeping this in mind, we decided to start the festival in 2013, because we felt like if you need to look at a city and urban issues or themes, it would be important to look at through various lenses, and through the lens of how artists and filmmakers have looked at it. This is the 4th edition, and this is the first edition actually where we had an open call entry along with some invited films. And it's also the first time that we are showing fiction films apart from non-fiction films and animation films. So thank you very much. And also special thanks to Goethe Institute for supporting the travel and stay of Markus Lenz. Thank you, it's really nice to have you here with us. And before I invite Markus to come and introduce his film, I'm going to introduce him, and now I'm going to read out of paper. Markus Lenz studied cultural and communication sciences in Leipzig and Palermo, degree in Masters of Arts in 2007. Between 2010 and 2013, he continued postgraduate studies at Cologne's Academy of Media Arts and University Nacional de Colombia in Bogota, specializing in documentary cinema. North Rhine-Westphalia's Ministry of Culture awarded him in 2015 with the Young Artist Award for his films. The film is 73 minutes, and Markus will be in conversation with Gautam after it. Welcome, Markus.
Hello to all the audience. I'm really glad to be here. Thank you very much for Urban Lens Film Festival and for the Goethe Institute for this invitation. I really enjoy to be here the first time in India and all. So I want to announce this film is an Indian premiere, so the first time shown here, and enjoy it, and let's talk afterwards.
Let me just introduce myself before I begin our conversation. My name is Gautam Bhan. I teach at the Indian Institute for Human Settlements. Markus, first of all, thank you for that film. Thank you for sharing it with us. Thank you for giving us an opportunity to see it. I'm told I have about 20 minutes, and I will, in keeping with the spirit of the film, be very disciplined and ask you just 3 questions, and then I will hand it over to the audience so that we can all discuss the film together. I just want to take a minute actually to see the film a bit from here, to see it, this is your first time here, but to see it from an Indian city in some way. And I'm struck in many ways by so many of the similarities that one encounters in the way our own cities have been built. So there was a term we learned from Latin America, which was the idea of auto-construction, came from favelas in Rio. And the idea of auto construction was about cities that weren't built by architects or planners or designers, certainly not the guy that shows up in the end of the last scene, but were cities that were built by people. That were built often through occupation, that were built often through squatting. And anyone who knows or has lived in any Indian city knows that a majority of the people and our fellow citizens and residents actually build cities through occupation rather than through planning. And I was struck though that one of the things that becomes so different then when you claim a city not by an economic purchase, by title, by buying, by property, but by labor, by making, by work, the amount of work that you hear in this film, the building of the walls, the endless construction, the constant moving, and the architect talks as if construction stopped. But what the film is telling us that it never stopped, right? There's a continuous process of building that lets people own that tower. But the one thing that's so strikingly different is the verticality, is the sense of a tower in the center of the city, is not a sense of what we would call, quote unquote, the slum that you can drive by, the low rise, low density, temporary, the idea of a different kind of claim. So maybe we'll start there. In one way, what does verticality do to this idea of the slum, of this claim? You introduce us to the tower through the voice of someone who lives outside it, and he says something really interesting. He says, the city is discriminated against. And that's the sentence that he uses about the fact that downtown can't look like this, capital can't look like this. So what does, in this sense, verticality do?
First aspect is that the neighborhood is affected by this, no? That the tower is inside the middle of the city center, and as if it was a statement by the community itself to say, okay, you just can't ignore us anymore, we are here. We are inside the middle of the bank, when you said on Wall Street, and just hear our voices. And that's also how it affected me, or how it touched me, because I saw also this building, it's so impressive, this building facade in the middle of this. And that was also my first contact with this building, so I saw the pictures and the images of it, and I just couldn't believe that it's true, that something could exist inside. Not the informal settlements on the outskirts of the city. And I think this is the same as here in India, also in several Latin American and all Latin American big metropolis cities. And but this is the first time also inside such a different like economic area, no? Like this banking complex. And there were working banks around. You can see from one office, one bank office, where the people are working in front of the computers. You can see like 30 meters distance, other people who construct the red bricks and the balconies. And so this harsh contrast. Also, there is one neighborhood where I made the first interviews, the first scene, and also the two guys who are telling that the city is discriminated, as you said before. They are living in a very old school neighborhood of Caracas, and they were even there before this bank complex was built, and so this was also a question of maybe envy. Why can they be there inside this building for free and we have to pay our rent? And okay, the other part of verticality you mentioned is maybe the internal organization inside the tower. That is very different to keep control in different floors when there is no lift working, and where the only way to reach the other floor above is through the stairs, were often without lights. It's very complicated to climb up there, because it's also dangerous and people fell, and you take 20 minutes to go to the 28th floor, for example, by feet. And especially for pregnant women or for old women, it's difficult. So it's very difficult to keep everything in control. And that's why I think verticality has also an influence on this such harsh organization system and the system of sanctions, no? If the people do not fit to the rules.
Talk to us a little bit about this sense of sanctions. One thing that's so striking about the notion of the informal settlement, whether it's vertical or built in a different way, the charge that's leveled against it often by very much folks like the architect or the folks who, when the city is, that's being discriminated against, is you think about this as a place without the state, outside the plan, outside the law, outside the formal, right? But here you give us a glimpse into a world that is entirely governed, that has structures and rules and processes. I was so struck by when she draws the organizational chart of the cooperative, that is also then relating in so many ways to other kinds of the state. And I think one of the things that we have struggled with in understanding self-built housing, self-governed housing, is this question of what is the sense of capacity here? And where do we, and you have an open letter to Chavez that runs in the background. He shows up on the television, he shows up on the speeches. In the end, the old grandmother wants to go vote for him. There is still a claim to the state for a certain kind of help and recognition. And we end at a moment where the families are no longer in the tower, right? So the state appears at the end as a person that takes them away, not as a person who then builds those governance structures for them in some way. So when we think a little bit about the language of self-building, we're left either with the romance of community, we are all one, this is one revolution, etc., or we are left with the notion that without government, without the municipal, without the state, you can't self-organize, you can't rule, you can't sustain. Where were you left at the end of this film when you were seeing so much self-organization, but in the end the heavy arm of the state, but also the continuous appeals to the state for something? How then do we not romanticize this idea of community, but not also undermine the agency that's so visible about what is possible to organize by yourselves even in the harshest of conditions?
That's not easy to answer this question, it's very complex. So I think the biggest problem inside there was also, beside any other infrastructural problems, also a lack of privacy. So there were no ceilings. Maybe it's not easy to understand when you see the film, but there were just the walls, but the walls had no ceiling, so everything was open to the corridors. So imagine that your neighbor could hear like every single word you were speaking to your friend or to your wife, whoever, or to your kids, and that's why also they have to set down these strict rules to keep it a bit calm. At least there are so many different people from so various living conditions inside this building that the only way to keep an organizational system inside there were to set down these strict rules. Yeah, that's what all the people also told me. And for several inhabitants, it was not so easy. So they also tried to make like little rebellions, personal ones, or also organized against this harsh organizational systems. And then it comes again up to verticality, because the most rebellious groups were on the 28th floor, so in the last floor which was inhabited, no? And I also made some interviews with one of those guys. Now the situation calmed down, or when I was there before shooting, the situation calmed down, but some months before they had really fights, and also they closed the access to the last floor because they didn't want to adapt to the rules of the organization. But then somehow they managed to keep together. But you know, the higher you get, the more difficult it is to rule it or to control it. No? And that's also why the organizational system of the tower said, okay, we don't want to go up to the 20th floor because just like this, it's too complicated with this nearly 3,000 people who are living there. For me, of course, because I knew all these attempts from the the board of the cooperative to get in touch to the city administration and even to Chavez himself. I wish that also my documentary could be like a megaphone, you know, for the situation, because I really appreciated the work they have done. And but then, yeah, because Chavez was also popular for his populistic actions, and I think maybe he could have also helped them if he had knew it, no? But then he died before the film was finished. He died in March 2013, and the film was screened for the first time 1 year later. Yeah, but anyway, yeah, the film had no influences on the decision of the government, because the excuse at the end why they decided to empty the tower and to evacuate the people was the lack of security and safety, and why they didn't have seen it 7 or 8 years before. Nobody knows.
No, it's the question of when rules are imposed, particularly architectural standards, has been one of the biggest political fights in the right of people. So Liza Weinstein, writing about Harvey in Bombay, described it as the right to remain, the right to stay put, as opposed to the right to acquire, the right to property. But I was so struck by the mention of Chavez, because in one sense, Indian urbanists trying to find ways to argue for the right to the city have often looked to Latin America's turn to the left as the example, particularly in the global age, where state welfare is not an imagination that we can call upon anymore. We were looking at austerity and withdrawal and privatization in so many parts of the world, but the one exception was the Latin American case in many ways. And Chavez was very much, you hear his speech about the imperialistic tendencies and the anti-bourgeois, and one of the things that strikes me again about that notion of the anger of the architect is not so much that one can't claim housing rights in some way, because in Venezuela so much of that work happened at that time, as did in Brazil, but that you can't claim it here. You can't claim it on Wall Street. You can't claim it in the center. You can't claim it in a glass building. You can claim it in the favela. You can claim it on the periphery. You can claim it in the slum. And that tension seemed to run through the film so much, because really, if what the financial crisis in the late 2000s showed us globally is that buildings such as this that go through crisis can be sold, resold, repurposed, but only in that type of use. And at the end, in the open letter, when she says, if rich inhabitants had occupied, refurbished, completed the construction, the 10 million pesos that they needed, would this have worked out very differently? Would the bank just have become a luxury accommodation? And so I think that tension runs through. The last question that I have for you, Markus, is to put on, in one sense, not so much your observer and documenter hat, but your filmmaker hat, because one of the things that I think is so striking about the aesthetics of this film is how architectural it is, in the sense that you leave us with the sound of the building. So when you say there was no ceiling, you couldn't see it, but you could hear it. And I think one of the striking things about the film is the sense of constant scent of wind and of echo, and it struck me very much, a very similar vertical occupation is in the center of Johannesburg. We were talking about that earlier. And it's one that I've personally been able to visit. And one of the things that always stuck with me is that what you're left with is wind and echo, and these odd pockets of silence and darkness that suddenly come in the turn. And the film captures that so well, but it also gives us the monumentality of this building and the way the building and the city see each other. Talk to us a little bit about the choices you made as a filmmaker when you're both moving between the intense intimacy of these homes and the vast edifice of this building. I've always loved that the Spanish word for building is actually edificio, right? That it reminds you of the kind of, that sense of an edifice. How did you approach it actually aesthetically, in trying to hold these two scales together?
When I was, after the editing process with a sound engineer and sound designer, yes, she asked me, okay, should we erase these echoes? No, because maybe from a sound engineering point of view, it's disturbing. But yeah, it's a noise which can be erased like easily, but and I said no, this is it would destroy the atmosphere. No, I lived through, and I think which is really important, as you described also for the film. There's one scene for me when I see this scene, I really like feel inside the situation again. Maybe you didn't notice, but it's when Gladys, the main character, and after the first minutes in the beginning of the film, enters in her apartment and shows the apartment. So we enter from the quite silent, not silent, but there were some kids laughing, but these closed atmosphere, also sound atmosphere inside the building, inside her apartment, and then the sound totally changes, and this is no sound design, that was the natural voices you could hear every time the wind was blowing inside, and the balconies, and there was always fresh air, but you had the feeling that the street from 16 floors down crossed the apartment. It was really much more louder than down in the street. That was incredible because of all these echoes inside the building. It was really much potentious, and this was in some situations also difficult to make interviews because it was so noisy inside the building. And then I really tried also to capture the architecture from outside as well also inside, because it was very complicated. I spent weeks or months in trying to create also the inside landscape of the tower, which I hope is in some kind visible also for the audience, so to not get lost totally inside this tower, because it's easy to get lost. It's so different from every side when you're staying outside in the streets. Every angle seems to be another building, and and the same is the same complexity you have also inside. So I worked a lot of creating this inner landscape of architectural construction, and also with very photographic pictures and or images, and and some space also with that you have the ability, the possibility to look for several seconds to look and see what architecture of the building I can give to you.
Alright, I will keep my promise. I only snuck in a few extra questions in those three. I'll take two at a time, just so that get it. So the floor is open. Yes. And feel free to also just react to the film. It doesn't have to be a question.
Is this building unique in Venezuela? There are similar buildings where people occupy?
So I'll just repeat the question. The question is whether the building is unique in Venezuela, or whether there are similar buildings. Let me take two at a time. Or there are similar buildings that are occupied as well. So just check if mic can do that.
And what is the state's response to homelessness in general?
Sure. Let me take one in the front, but I'm going to have to ask someone to pass that.
Thanks. It was a wonderful film. Thank you so much for sharing it with us. I just wanted to ask about how you gained access to the building. Were they open to the media? Were they skeptical of you? And if you could just speak about that.
First question was, there is another similar building? No, I think there is no similar building in the entire world. I guess there are some occupied towers. One in Johannesburg, we heard before some minutes, and there are also in Latin America some occupied towers, but I think the special aspects of this building are its history first, that it was a bank and it still is inside the bank complex, and then also the inner organization. That was for me the unique power also of this building here. And there are also a lot of squads in Venezuela, and also during the Chavez regime there was support by the government to squat different places. So they had squatting programs from the government. That's also interesting. There were some different groups like Los Sin Techos, for example, is a group but they occupied places on the outskirts of the city, former farmland from
the land invasions.
More like this. Yeah, that's right. But there were also some kind of small building invasions, but they didn't end up community like.
I mean, what's interesting just to compare is that the Vodacom tower that Markus is referring to is the other similar vertical. It's a 65-floor tower in downtown Johannesburg that was occupied very much the same way until recently. But there is an interesting parallel here because both Sao Paulo, Cairo, and Johannesburg have histories of building occupation in addition to land invasion. And they function very differently as ways of creating informal and popular neighborhoods. And the Venezuelan state has tolerated and encouraged land invasions, but it goes back to that question of claiming the periphery of the city versus claiming its center, and why the occupation of the center is so unsettling. And in both Sao Paulo and Johannesburg, that occupation happened because capital left downtown, and it was seen as a failure of the city, and it much lamented by city mayors. In Johannesburg, it was because of apartheid. Right before '94, white capital left for the suburbs. And till today, downtown Johannesburg is seen as a failed neighborhood because according to city development planners, they see the absence of capital as opposed to the presence of people as a sign of success or failure. Do you want to ask the second question about access? About how you gained access to the neighborhood?
It was really very difficult for me to get access to the building. So before I get to Venezuela, I also had contact to another person who tried to make the same project, but stayed 8 weeks trying to get inside and didn't get access. So this this information I got some days before I left from Bogota to Caracas, and yeah, so I was a bit under pressure if it's gonna work out or not. And there was different how do you say, different phases. Maybe when they really had a lot of problems also with local authorities and the neighbors, they really closed the tower for several months, and nobody, some people from friendly organizations who helped them couldn't get access even if they knew them like years before. And yeah, I was lucky then at the end because I tried from every side. Also, first I had tried to get contacts to journalists, to the local TV stations, to Telesur, which is a big TV program in Latin America, to get a good contact inside from an expert from outside. But there was really nobody who entered this building, nobody, and this made it so difficult for me, to find an expert who could give me a neutral opinion of what was going on. The other opinions I get were really prejudices from the people outside who just had the image, this ruined facade, and imagined what kind of criminals could live in such a building. This was the situation, and so that's why I tried and knocked on the door. But then first they said no, it's not possible. They didn't want to have any contacts to media or to people with camera because there were so many bad videos on YouTube discriminating the people, and and then I got a contact to a girl who lived there, and she gave me the telephone number of Gladys, and then I called her every day. I don't know how many times I really stalked her, but I could hear in her voice that she was kind of interested. And then finally we met up. She said, okay, I try something, I try to get to know, and I try to also, I make a proposal to all the board members, and then let's see. And yes, finally we had an appointment and she let us inside.
please don't say you got stalking as a documentary strategy at the Urban Lens Festival, but I'll take the first hand there, and then one at the back, and then one at the front. So 1, 2, 3, and can we take them together? Yeah.
Hi, I think the great possibility of a film like this is that it can explore the kind of tension between the ordinary and the extraordinary. I'm here at the back. And also between containment and flows. And I find it very fascinating how you've sort of brilliantly managed to not give us a glimpse of the extraordinariness of that a space like this can, is bound to get people, kind of, bring into people's lives. So I was wondering what made you contain the narrative to do mainly with governance, because I'm sure you would have come across stories and moments that sort of took you by surprise. For example, I was just wondering if you actually took the camera and filmed somebody climb up the 28 floors, because that constructs a different relationship with time in some sense. So yeah, I was really taken by the extraordinariness of the people's lives there, even architecturally. It's not an architecture that's familiar or known, it's something that's constantly having to be navigated and created. And there was so much potential of risk and precarity and all of that to come into the story. So maybe you could talk a little bit about your decisions as a filmmaker to stick with the governance story.
Go back.
I think I better stand. So forgive me, but mine is a little bit of a comment and a suggestion and a question. I'll try and be fast. First of all, thank you for this very powerful film with such universal ramifications. I was reminded of the tower burning in London recently, which again housed council inmates and what happened to them thereafter, and the saga is continuing. And I think it cost Theresa May her landslide that was predicted and she never got. So I think these subjects are just so important and happening everywhere. The suggestion is that I think you should do your next tower film in India. In Mumbai we have a tower, 64 floors high, owned by the most powerful, whatever billionaire, I don't know what they're called, trillionaire of our country, who, by the way, owns most of India's media. And I'm a journalist, so yes. And all around, the view from that tower is of, what you talked about, your conversation talked about the slums which are there, down there. They're not in towers in India, but they're spread in shanties. And I don't know if you've landed in Mumbai, but you see it as you land in the city of, where real estate property is more than what it costs in New York. Sorry, I'm being a little long-winded, but just making it, yeah. And my question now to you is that, we see the images of Venezuela and what's happening there. Under those circumstances, I would imagine that people would just rush into this tower and occupy it all over again. Why isn't it happening? And have you been there of late? Are you getting news from there? What's going on?
Last, right, come to there. Can you just raise your hand again so they'll know it's back? And then, so
thanks also for the movie. It was very, very interesting. My question is probably similar to yours. She speaks about the physicals precariousness that the film obviously speaks to, but in the United States we have plenty of examples of towers that are physically violent, creating kind of spaces where people are unsafe for criminal types of activity. Was it unsafe, and could you speak to the security of the people that were living there, if that was an issue at all?
Didn't feel unsafe at all when I entered this building, yeah. But the people from outside, there we came back to all these prejudices from people who just don't know. They told me, okay, when you step inside, maybe you will never come out. And this really was the...
People will tell you that in India,
Yeah.
going to neighborhoods exactly the same way.
Okay. And, but yeah, it's obvious that there's such kind of good working internal organization, and that's what impressed me also so much. That's why I also put the focus on it. But of course, they are also focused with a lot of, like, let's say, criminal problems. I also touched this in the film, that they had to kick out drug dealers, and prostitution is a problem. And that's why they have strict rules for the girls not to wear specific clothes and stuff like that. But yeah, compared to other neighborhoods around or in the outskirts of Caracas, it was really calm inside, yeah. And I really, maybe I felt much more insecure when I walked around the other neighborhoods in the evening, yeah. And I lost the question.
Why wasn't it reoccupation?
Yeah, why? Okay. I also was thinking about when I heard from Gladys that so police and military police came to secure the building and to settle them out to other places. So this was kind of spontaneous, and I thought about going back also to film that, because yeah, it could have been part of the story. The problem was that the editing process was finished and the film was screened, and I wasn't sure, but at the end maybe I wouldn't have made it, because they really kept an eye on it, not to produce images of that. And yeah, what I heard right now is there were different plans and options for this building. So first I heard that a Chinese bank wanted to buy it and reconstruct it in another way as a bank. Imagine that. And but yeah, another option was to make it like a hospital center inside. And I don't know what are the plans right now. I think it's really complex also to reconstruct it, because yeah, as the architect said, the steel rusted. They I don't know if it's static anymore, and if it could have also survived, or if it could survive earthquakes, and it lacks of security in any kind of perspective. Yeah, that was the let's say the number one need in the agenda of these people, no? To get some kind of security and in their just ordinary way of living, or make a living in an apartment or a house. So, and that reflected also for me to put the focus on this contact to the government. Yeah, they worked so hard on it, and yeah.
So I do have to wrap up. I'm sorry, I know many of you will have many questions. Markus is at the reception, so do join him there and talk to him about it there. And in the concluding note, I just want to say, I think for many of us grappling with some of these questions, one of the ways in which the very literal vertical reality of this is facing us in Indian cities is that a lot of our new housing programs have shifted their focus from upgrading what we call the basti or the settlement as it is into the vertical reconstruction of units. And the 25 square meter unit has become kind of the central focus of our new housing policies, which has changed the relationship of housing to not working with what people have built, self-built or constructed, because we very often forget that the people who live in informal settlements are workers, masons, carpenters, traders, plumbers. They are the people who built all our homes, not just their own homes. And one of the things that struck me very much when I saw him putting the brick and the cement is that memory of what it feels like to be in informal settlements in Indian cities. Everyone is constantly building, is constantly working. So you drive by the road and the concrete bars stick out of the brick, half the work is working, because you make the house as you live in it. You don't move into a completed house. That notion of housing as a process, as a life of housing is time. And I think that moment here, that what you saw here was housing very literally as time. And it was a time with a finite end, because at the end none of those buildings are in the tower. But that process of making, occupying, squatting, building, moving will continue to define housing for many people. And I think it's for us to constantly remember it and remind ourselves in moments like this that this is what actually builds cities. It's not the practices that we consider that control cities, which is much more the professional practices of architecture and planning that many of us teach and practice. So thank you for reminding us of that. Thank you for this film. Thank you very much, all of you, for joining us and for those questions. We look forward to seeing you at the city campus in Sadashivanagar for the next 3 days of films. And join us at the reception, join Markus, and once again, thank you to the Goethe Institute and Max Muller for hosting us. Thank you very much.